We've had a little more difficulty with Sri Lanka and Maldives, where we've seen a direct intervention by China on the political system in both countries. So in effect now you have at least one group or two out of three groups in the case of Sri Lanka who are on India's side and one was on China's, and that's been a sort of steady battle that's going back and forth, if you wish. Nepal has not worked out as well as the government would have hoped. But broadly speaking, I would argue that the neighborhood policy, the small neighborhood policy of India, is in much better shape than it was pre-2014, with Bangladesh being at the heart of the big shift. The two other regions that, to the west of India, that there have been a lot more focus on, have been the Gulf and Africa. In the Gulf, another part of the world where India has been economically dependent on both for oil, for remittances, and various other issues, we've had remarkably little political and diplomatic influence. Today, I would argue, both the United Arab Emirates and the Saudi Arabians have completely changed their foreign policy around, and now have aligned themselves, at least on a number of issues. Definitely UAE has. With India. They are now much closer, again UAE leading the front, to us than they are, for example, to their traditional friend Pakistan. And to some degree, I would argue UAE is now one of the 3 or 4 most important countries in terms of our bilateral relationships in the world. Africa is a place where you've seen the Indian private sector take the lead. We are now the 3rd largest trading partner for the continent of Africa, after the European Union and after China. We've overtaken Japan, quietly overtaken the United States, and are now in a position of unusual influence in Africa, given that it's a continent that the government has neglected virtually since the mid-1960s. And countries like Mozambique, for example, we have a situation where India trains its entire military, its intelligence, its diplomatic corps, and is one of its single largest foreign investors. If in theory we were able to extract all the natural gas reserves we own in Mozambique, we would not need to import natural gas in the next 30 years. So these are the kind of things that are happening on the western side and in our region. Now, Southeast Asia is another part, obviously, of this picture. There we have struggled, and I would argue, on 3 areas. Pradeep has already gone into the fact that our weakness, one of our biggest weaknesses on the multilateral front, continues to be on trade diplomacy. And so obviously for ASEAN that's been an issue. But India's also been troubled at the fact that ASEAN itself has struggled as an entity to produce a sufficient response, for example, on the South China Sea, in terms of its internal coherence with sort of the countries centered around Thailand versus those centered around Singapore, moving seemingly in different directions. And the fact that we have good relations with 2 or 3 of the ASEAN countries, even on the military sense, but have not been able to do that with others. And you'll notice now for the first time the Indian government is publicly saying that ASEAN centrality is in question. We've seen the Indian foreign minister now say that at least twice. So you have, should we say, at the diplomatic and political military level, ASEAN is seen as a entity that is not in great shape. But on the other hand, of course, India's ability to move in on ASEAN on the trade and economic front is limited. So what we've been doing in ASEAN, what we're trying to do, is really partnering with the other really enormous relationship, arguably the most important one in India today, which is Japan. Japan has emerged, the present foreign minister, when he was retiring as foreign secretary 2 years ago, was asked, what do you see as our most important strategic partner? He said it's probably becoming Japan. Japan's willingness to invest in India on a non-commercial basis, largely for strategic reasons, to build us up, kicking and screaming to some extent, into something much more competitive, much more economically powerful, is really unprecedented. Probably only, I would argue, maybe the US Marshall Fund activities in Europe are comparable to what's happening now between India and Japan. But not only that, Japan and India are now joining hands together in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in Kenya, in Southeast Asia, working together, where India will often lead diplomatically or come to Japan and say, we recommend X, Y, and Z. And Japan says, don't worry, we have the money and the technical capacity. And this has been an enormous boost for India, because India's credibility on building infrastructure is basically zero. We can't build it in India, how are we going to build it overseas? But if the Japanese are in the room, it's a completely different story. Because the Japanese credibility is better than literally anybody, including the Chinese, when it comes to actually doing things. So having Japan on board, and you notice recently, and I'm curious to see whether it's actually going to be true, the Japanese trade negotiator has said that if India is not part of RCEP, Japan may have to pull out as well. In making it very clear that maybe on the trade side, RCEP makes sense to Japan, geopolitically it does not without India. So you're starting to see, and I know that when I've talked to Indian diplomats, that our conversations on the state of Asia and the world with Japan now are at levels that do not even happen between Japan and the United States. The other element of the foreign policy that I argue that he's navigated reasonably well has been the great power relationships. The trickiest, of course, in many ways, especially under the Trump administration, has been the United States. We've seen a general positive trajectory going back to the late Clinton period, continuing to a huge surge under George Bush, continuing to some extent under Obama. Trump comes in, what we see in America now, at least I would argue, is multiple foreign policy, with the president having his own foreign policy that's quite independent of anybody else, including his own White House, and then you have the establishment, the Pentagon, the State Department, and so on. So the goal of most countries now is, can you see that all three levels of the United States are more or less in a line with yours? Then it works. I would argue India is one of the few major countries in which that is actually happening. Trump has a problem with us on trade, though he has a problem with pretty much every country in the world on trade. So that's to be a given, perhaps. But he likes Modi, which is not easy to accomplish, because Trump and Modi in many ways are personalities that don't necessarily gel together. But and Trump has strange dislikes. He doesn't like President Moon of South Korea, even though, and the South Koreans are quite open about this. It was one of our biggest problems, is that Trump really pulls a face whenever he sees Moon. He doesn't like Angela Merkel, even though Germany is in many ways America's closest relationship in Europe. And you talk to German diplomats, and it's amazing. We have a US president who is of German descent and denies that he's of German descent. In interviews he's asked, he says, no, I'm Swedish, which is complete nonsense. But he so dislikes Germany that he prefers to deny what everybody knows, that his grandfather was from Bavaria. So the Trump side, we've been able to sustain some sort of a functional relationship with him. On the Washington establishment, there's absolutely no problems whatsoever. If anything, our struggle is to absorb what America wants to give us, for example, in defense and so on and so forth. So America has been actually rather good. It's been the problems of trying to handle the internal issues within the United States that have been an issue. And you've talked to Indian diplomats again, they said literally other than trade, we have no major problems with the United States. Russia is a country that we've been struggling with because the relationship, Russia as it shrinks, if you wish, from superpower to great power to regional power status. Its GDP is now half of that of India's. Its life expectancy is the same as of Libya. This is a country that has the trappings or the remnants of a great power, but it's not one that can provide as much as it used to. So for us, you can see the shift now moving from a defense relationship built out of the Soviet Union, increasingly to one based on energy. And therefore, but it maintains the loyalty of Russia to us, which has proven to be useful, even though broadly I would argue it's a declining relationship. But it's one of the things that we've had to adjust. Then there's finally, of course, China. And in China, I would argue there is a managerial approach on both sides, an agreement, if you wish, which we've both been struggling with, that we don't really want to get into each other's hair, but fundamentally we don't necessarily like each other. And that has been the primary purpose, I would argue, of India's China policy now for at least the past 2 or 3 prime ministers. And in Modi's case, we saw it decline rapidly over the first 2 or 3 years. We had the Dalai Lama succession battle, which will come back to haunt us sometime later. We had the battle of the Belt Road Initiative, which I would argue India took the lead in arguing that this was geopolitical, not a benign economic infrastructure. And then finally, it ended up in a military confrontation in Doklam. What was good about this is not so much that it went down, is that at the end of Doklam, India was able to make the argument, if you wish, of both sides agreed, and the Chinese agreed that this was not the direction that they wanted to go. And if you want, therefore, let's revamp the relationship in another direction. So it's been worked, and one of the things that it is, I've noticed, or what seems to be the case, is that other countries have actually argued that India has taken the right approach. The United States Pentagon Chief James Mattis came to India soon after the Doklam crisis. And he said, the first thing I want is a blow-by-blow account of how you ended up in where you are or what ended up in Doklam. And when the Indian side said, we'll do it, but why are you so interested? He said, because you're really the first country to stand up to China in decades. America failed to do so in the South China Sea. He was particularly scathing about ASEAN, which he said was completely incapable of standing up to anything. And even the Japanese have struggled to some extent. But he said, you're the first people to force them to go back to their original positions in many decades. And the good thing about that so far is that the Chinese have actually increased their respect for us and worked better with us since then. So I think overall you have, given the changing nature of geopolitics in the world, and it's really been rapidly changing, it's marked of course by the decline of the United States, it's that India has adjusted accordingly in many ways, and broadly I would argue has been able to leverage its economic size, its military capabilities, and its geography in a reasonably sound manner. No major foreign policy disasters, no major failures, and quite a number of big successes, and I would argue, and I stress the Gulf as being a particularly important accomplishment. And the relationship with Japan is something that I think needs to be watched closely because it remains in many ways the biggest accomplishment. This is a country where you may remember that in 1962, when we went to war with China, the Japanese actually told, the Japanese foreign minister said he thought that India actually deserved to be beaten by China. It was so much contempt for India in many ways. And today, Prime Minister Modi is very clear that Abe is his closest friend in the world. And it's been a remarkable shift in that relationship. Maybe I'll end it there and we can look at.
Very good. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of perspectives there. I think we're going to run a little longer than we thought, so I think we'll end at 1:15 and go outside for lunch then. Let me ask each